Well, my name is Rodman Philbrick. I didn't start out writing books for kids. For years, I wrote mystery novels and detective stories and thrillers and medical thrillers under my own name and other names. And then when I was in my early 40s, I stumbled upon an idea for a book about kids. And I had so much fun writing it. It was called Freak the Mighty, although I continue to write books for adults, I still try to write every couple of years another book for young readers. I started writing in about 6th grade, actually. I'm not quite sure what gave me the thought that I could be a writer, except that I love to read books. And I have 3 younger brothers. And when we used to entertain ourselves, when my mother would encourage us to go outside and play so that she could have a moment of sanity in the house, we often acted out stuff we'd seen on television or read in books. So somehow or other, when I was in 6th grade, I got it into my head that I could write too, and I tried to write short stories. They were mostly very short stories, a page or a page and a half with a trick ending. And I began to have them typed up and try to send them out to magazines with the idea that I would keep this a big dark secret from everybody until I became a famous author overnight. That didn't happen when I was in junior high school. I wrote many stories, and then when I was in high school, I still hadn't sold a story, and I hadn't told anybody that I was a writer because I didn't want to be made fun of, frankly. I wanted to announce it the moment I became famous. I decided in high school that short stories weren't working, so I would have to write a novel. And so I did. When I was a sophomore, I wrote what I thought of as a novel. I now think of as a series of short stories about the same 2 characters. And I was once again convinced that when I had it typed up and brought it into a publisher that I would become famous overnight. And then everybody who thought I was just sort of some jerky kid in the back of the room would be really glad that they knew me. But they managed to resist the temptation to turn me into a famous teenage author. And it wasn't until I was in my late 20s and had written 7 or 8 novels that I was finally able to sell a book. And that was books for adults, thrillers and mysteries. As I say, it wasn't until later on that I discovered that there was a 12-year-old boy's voice in my head that wanted to keep telling me stories. I do sometimes get asked why I have written under several names, and it's not because I was writing from prison. I was always writing from my desk. But basically, when I was writing mystery novels, I was a certain kind of detective story I wrote, and then when I wrote a different kind of story, the publisher asked me if I could put it under a different name. So of course I said yes, wanting to sell the book. And that's happened a couple of different times over the years. But all of my books for younger readers have been written as Rodman Philbrick, which is in fact my name. So I'm going to try sticking to that one for a while.
And what was the transition like moving from adult?
I found that there wasn't a great deal of difference for me in writing for kids or adults, except in some of the content of the stories. Obviously, I wanted the books for younger readers to be a bit shorter and easier to read because I was interested in trying to get to kids who weren't necessarily already in love with books. And so I would try to make the stories, and some of the things I learned writing mysteries and thrillers is that you always have to find a way to get the reader to turn the page. So even though I'm not writing a mystery or a thriller for kids, I'm writing sort of straight stories, I still want to have that sense of suspense working. And so I try to keep the story moving as best I can. The only difference is that my kids' books are told through the eyes of an 11 or 12-year-old instead of a 30 or 40-year-old. And so I just stick with what I remember of what it was like to be 12 years old. Now, I found that I like sounding like a 12-year-old boy. This was not a great surprise to my wife, Lynn, who'd been hearing me for years, but I didn't know that about myself until I started writing for younger readers. And I think it's because I started writing in 6th grade made me remember 6th and 7th grade with great detail. I can remember all the rooms that I had in my classes in 6th grade, who my teachers were, who sat next to me in class, what it looked like out the window. And I think I remember that vividly, more vividly than, say, my brothers do, because I was writing things, and that sort of reinforced my memory. A lot of writing is about memory and how you see detail. And I think it helped me a lot that I started writing young when I began to be interested in writing about characters who were that age. I've had the most wonderful time on my most recent book, which is called The Mostly True Adventures of Homer P. Figg. Now, it's called The Mostly True Adventures because Homer has a problem with the truth. He tends to stretch it a little bit. And I wanted to write a story about a boy from my home state of Maine who comes from a really bad background. He and his brother are orphaned, and they live on their uncle's farm. And their uncle is known as the meanest man in Maine. And he makes them live in the barn and just works them on the farm. And when Homer's older brother, who is his hero, when his older brother turns 17, suddenly he's big enough to stand up to the uncle, and the uncle doesn't like that at all. And so the uncle essentially sells him off to the Union Army as a replacement fee. They had just started the draft of people during the American Civil War. And Homer is so concerned that his brother will be killed in the war that he runs away from this farm in upstate Maine and travels all the way south until he gets to Gettysburg. And needless to say, there's an involvement at the Battle of Gettysburg with Homer and his older brother. But what I wanted to do was tell a story about the background to the Civil War, all the things that were going on off the battlefield. Now, it culminates in one of the great battles of the Civil War, which I chose because my home state, fellows from Maine, had something to do with that battle. But I wanted it to be not only an informative adventure, but I wanted it to be exciting, and I wanted to try to make something happen on every page. In other words, I wanted to draw the readers in rather than making it a homework assignment. So believe it or not, although the book is only 200 pages, it took me 3 or 4 years to write. I didn't have the voice of Homer quite right. I wasn't sure exactly what he sounded like. And when I finally had his voice, then the book went quickly, and all the research I'd done over the months was there for me to use in the book, hopefully in a way where it won't seem like a homework assignment. One of the things that young writers find difficult sometimes is getting the voice of a character. And I try to convince them that what they need to do is think about it for a while. You have to live inside the head of your character a while and begin to see the story through that character's eyes, and then really think of them as a real person. That's the method I use. And so my character, Homer Fig, in The Mostly True Adventures of Homer Fig, I knew it was going to be a boy of about 12 years old, and I knew he would be small. But that's all I really knew about him. And I had to let him sort of take shape in my mind as I did some of the research. Now, one of the things I hear from young writers is that they make mistakes. And the great thing about writing is that you can always fix the mistakes. And the best way to do that, after you've written something, is to put it down for a day or so, and then read it again and try to imagine that you are the reader who's reading your work. And you have to be kind of vicious about it. You have to cross out all the extra stuff. But, you know, any mistake you make can be corrected. If you were doing it in a drawing, you'd be able to get your eraser and erase it over again. And nobody ever gets it right the first time, and that includes me. None of the books that are published are ever the first draft. I go through what I've written the day before is the first thing I look at this morning when I sit down to write. And I go through it, and I try to make it as clear and crisp as I possibly can so that it's easily understood and so that I understand what's going on. And so that's one of the great things about writing. It's not like acting where you're going to get stuck out on stage forgetting your lines, because you can always take the time to find what needs to be said in your story. So don't worry about making mistakes. We all make a million mistakes, and you're going to contribute to that total.
Any other advice for students?
The other thing for young writers to really remember is, don't worry about trying to make it an absolutely original story the first time you'd write. Write the kind of story that you like to read. It's part of an exercise, it's part of practice. I tell kids who are interested in athletics, you know, you could have all the talent, all that eye-hand coordination that makes a great basketball player, and you're not going to get to be in the NBA unless you practice hours a day. It's really no different for writing or the arts or anything that's creative. If you like to do it, you have to do a lot of it to get good at it. And the other thing with writers is you have to listen to people. If you'll just be quiet sometimes and listen to what people will tell you, they will tell you the most amazing things that you can then steal from their lives and use in your own stories. But be sure to change their names. And try not to write about your parents the first time, or you're going to get yourself in big trouble. Now, for any kids who are interested in doing book reports, now I hated to do book reports when I was a boy, but I did them anyways, and I actually sometimes had fun with it. But if you're interested in finding out information that you can use on book reports or author reports, I invite any of the kids to go to my website at rodmanphilbrick.com and take the time to click through all the links. There's a lot of stuff on there, and you can find out all kinds of interesting things that you can then use in your reports. And I'll try to link to anything that's interesting as well. So use your investigative skills as a user of the internet, and you'll be surprised what you might discover. I did a thing for the Scholastic website a few years ago about writing book reports. So any kids who were interested in that process, or teachers who were interested in introducing writing into the classes, I invite them to go Google that and drill back down through it until you find Rodman Philbrick book reports. And there may be a thing or two about book reports. Now, I will confess that I never got anything but a B on my book reports when I was a kid, but this is an A+ effort that I use. So if I could go back and rewrite my book reports, I'll bet I'd get an A this time. This is chapter 5 from my novel, The Mostly True Adventures of Homer P. Figg. Now, Homer, my hero, has run away from his terrible circumstances on this really hard-scrabble farm in Maine, and he's searching for his brother who's been taken into the army, and he's stolen the horse that belonged to his mother from his uncle, and it's the dark of night. This chapter is chapter number 5, Bears as Big as Boulders. You probably already know this, but horses don't like to go places at night any more than sensible folks do. A horse has his patterns and his habits, and night is for standing around and sleeping. For a while, Bob keeps trying to turn back, his eyes rolling white and fearful, but he doesn't fight me too much, all things considered. Good horse, I keep telling him, mostly so I can hear the sound of my own voice, because the forest has a way of creaking and groaning that puts a lump of nothing in my stomach. It's only the tall trees, I keep telling myself, the pine and the spruce and the hackmatack moving in the wind, the way their long bows brush like fingers and make a sighing you can feel deep in your bones. Good horse, I say, good horse. It's not like we're moving fast. Bob's old and slow. Besides, even a young horse can't run in the dark or he'll break a leg for sure. Has to see the ground or he doesn't feel connected. I walk Bob for miles and then skinny up onto his back and let him walk me for a while. Under the night shadows of the mighty trees, finding our path through the blind darkness, me and that good old horse. All the time Harold is in my mind, how he must have marched and marched with a stick on his shoulder and the whiskey sergeant shouting orders. Does it scare him to be that far from home? Does he know I might follow? Do his feet hurt? Then I get to fussing that bears might get him. Black bears as big as boulders, and it makes me so fearful that the shadows start to look like hungry bears, and the spruce branches are the bear's long teeth snapping at us from behind. Bob the horse, he knows I'm afraid, and that makes him afraid too, and he starts to pick up the pace. Whoa, now hold. I pull back on the reins, but the horse won't stop. He's got an idea in his head, and the idea is to run away from the darkness and the shadows. Run until he gets to daylight and can see the world again. All I can do is hang on, clinging to his thick neck, branches whipping all around us so close I can smell the pine needles. The horse snorting with fear and shaking his head to keep clear of the reins, running blind at a full gallop, trusting his hooves to find the way, not caring what the next step brings. Figure any second he'll trip and break a leg, and I'll go flying and crack my skull on the trees or the rocks, and that will be the end of my adventures. But just as fast as he bolted, Bob starts to slow down. He's run out of oats and remembered how old he is, and he can't run that fast no more, and he's heaving and gasping and snorting up a lather. Got to rest the horse or he'll die on me for certain. Poor old thing is shaking, he's so wrung out, and making funny little noises deep in his throat, and that means he's still plenty scared. Me too, because I can hear something in the dark that shouldn't be there. Voices, folks talking. 2 men, sounds like. One of them low and rumbly so the words are muffled. But the other voice, the one that's doing all the telling, that voice is clear as a bell. Kill that son of a bee, it says. Kill him while we got the chance. And you'll have to go on to the next chapter to find out what happens next.